From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy. The German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this conversation with U.S. Undersecretary of State Keith Krach, Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Undersecretary, thank you so much for being with us. We're really delighted to have you here today. The Undersecretary plays a key role in many issues of transatlantic concern, and of course, as you've just heard, GMF's mission is strengthening transatlantic cooperation, so we'll get to talk about some of those critical issues today. And our conversation today will be on the theme of clean networks and 5G in the context of NATO security, but also economic objectives. I'll let our moderator say more to introduce our speaker in a little more detail, but also to say more about our theme in a moment. But before I do that, let me also just take a moment to thank the US mission to NATO, the US mission to the EU, and to bilateral embassy here in Brussels for all the things that we do together and for our partnership. We're really very, very grateful. And now I'm very pleased also to introduce our moderator, my colleague from GMF in Washington, Ambassador Karen Kornbluh, is our senior fellow and also director of GMF Digital. Karen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and welcome to our audience. And we're absolutely delighted to host this conversation with Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Keith Krach, who is in the middle of a 10-city European tour. I'll just say a little bit about his remarkable background. Undersecretary Krach is incredibly knowledgeable about the tech sector. In fact, he played a key role in the development of the global technology ecosystem. He was CEO and chairman of DocuSign, which provides electronic signature and digital transaction management solutions, has 400 million users in 188 countries. He co-founded the world's largest business-to-business e-commerce network. He was CEO of a leading provider in mechanical design automation software, and in fact has been a leader in venture capital and in manufacturing, serving as the youngest ever vice president of General Motors, where he led the formation of the company's first Japanese joint venture, GMF Robotics, which gave rise to one of the largest robotics companies. He's the recipient of many awards, including the World Economic Forum Technology Pioneer Award, the Bay Area's Most Admired CEO Award, and Harvard Business School's Business Leader of the Year Award. He's also served as the chairman of the Board of Trustees for Purdue University, where he initiated a new model for STEM education and workforce training. So we welcome you here today. We're thrilled to host your remarks.
Karen, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I wonder if somebody could turn off the echo on. Sorry about that. Karen, that was an overly generous introduction. And good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for joining me here today. It's wonderful to be back in Europe after being gone so long during this COVID crisis. It's really the first country, first continent swing in a long time. And the work of the German Marshall Fund informs decision makers here in Europe and as well as the United States. Your contribution towards transatlantic bonds is invaluable and appreciated. And I'd like to talk to you today about the reality that NATO faces as an alliance of 30 nations. It's one of an ever-increasing cyber warfare and seemingly ceaseless variations of intense, perhaps even weaponized economic competition. The Chinese Communist Party presents a real and urgent threat to democracies and companies here in Europe and around the world. The CCP has exploited the institutions of the free world, such as the WTO, to gain an upper hand over the same free nations that enable its prosperity. Rather than open up, the Chinese government intensified its aggression. It imposed market restrictions, forced technology transfers, and stole intellectual property. I've had that experience myself in Silicon Valley. You know, we're all free traders, but when someone comes into a market and doesn't play by the rules, the market is no longer free. We all thought capitalism would equal democracy, but in China's case, we were wrong. As Secretary Pompeo says, it's time to take off our rose-colored glasses and treat China not how we'd hope they be, but how they truly are. Now, both sides of the aisle back in Washington understand that the Chinese Communist Party is playing the long game, and they're playing for keeps. They fancy themselves as masters of a four-dimensional game of economic, military, diplomatic, and cultural chess. And worst of all, they believe they're above the rules. In this high-stakes competition, there's nothing static about NATO security. It can vanish in an instant, and there is no substitute for a coalition of freedom. A challenge of this magnitude cannot be done alone. It's a team sport, and it will require the synergistic effects across all our governments as well as our powerful private sector. To prevent the CCP's authoritarianism from winning the day on 5G, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently remarked, "We have to make sure that Europe and North America stand together to face that China challenge." For years, the CCP has been putting pressure on telecommunication companies and countries to buy from Huawei, knowing that its national intelligence law can oblige Huawei to share data from these countries and companies at any time. CCP's stated doctrine is to seduce with money and reinforce with intimidation and retaliation. Untrusted high-risk vendors like Huawei and ZTE provide the CCP's authoritarian government the capacity to disrupt or weaponize critical applications and infrastructure, or provide technological advances to China's military forces. It should surprise no one that Huawei is under indictment in the United States for bank fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, violating sanctions, racketeering, and misappropriating intellectual property from 6 U.S. tech companies. And it's no secret that Huawei stole intellectual property from T-Mobile, the U.S. subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom. We know that it deploys these same tactics in Europe or wherever it can get a foothold. Given these dangers, governments and businesses around the world are increasingly asking, who do we trust to carry our most personal information and intellectual property? The primary choices are 2 world-class European vendors on one side, Ericsson and Nokia, and 2 CCP-controlled companies on the other, Huawei and ZTE. After this year, there should be no doubt about the answer. From concealing an outbreak that became a pandemic, to eviscerating Hong Kong's freedoms, to persisting with ruthless campaign of repression in Xinjiang, the CCP's human rights abuses are impossible to ignore. This behavior is made possible by an Orwellian Big Brother surveillance state that tracks billions of people worldwide and extends that great one-way China firewall, where all the data comes in for CCP's use, but none goes out. And reciprocally, all the propaganda goes out, but the truth does not come in. UK Foreign Secretary Rob recently remarked that it isn't just the devastation of COVID-19 that takes the shine off of China, but also the fact that CCP doesn't live up to the deals that it makes. The crackdown in Hong Kong is a case in point. As Foreign Secretary Rob said, It comes down to an issue of trust. He said, why would anyone trust China with other deals they might make? The Transatlantic Alliance has a responsibility to protect the integrity of our networks for nearly 1 billion citizens living under our security umbrella. That's why the United States has teamed up with like-minded nations to develop the Clean Network, which is a comprehensive approach to address the long-term threats to data privacy, security, human rights, and trusted collaboration. Its 5G Clean Path initiative complements the work done by the EU member states in developing the Clean EU 5G Toolbox for designing, constructing, and administering 5G infrastructure. Prime Minister of Poland, Morawiecki, recently commented, Poland believes the construction of our 5G Clean Path network is a prerequisite for strategic technological sovereignty. That's why we're proud to be a 5G clean country. The Clean Network is rooted in internationally accepted digital trust standards and represents the execution of a multi-year enduring strategy built on a coalition of trusted partners. The Clean Network encompasses the entire system by incorporating additional clean initiatives to safeguard mobile carriers, apps, cloud-based systems, and undersea cables, because a system is only as strong as its weakest link. It sparked a wave of countries and companies choosing clean vendors for their 5G networks. Already, many NATO allies are following suit. The 5G tide has turned toward clean, trusted vendors as more and more countries and companies are using clean providers to build 5G clean network. Huawei deals are evaporating as everyone begins to realize it's an arm of the CCP surveillance state and a tool for human rights abuse. The Clean Network now includes over 30 countries around the world. Many are European, such as the Czech Republic, Norway, Poland, Sweden, Estonia, Romania, Denmark, Greece, Finland, Luxembourg, most recently Serbia and Kosovo, Albania, Latvia, France, United Kingdom, and Slovenia. Most countries' largest telecommunication companies, such as Telefonica, Telco Italia, Reliance in India, Telstra in Australia, SK and KT in Korea, and all the telcos in Japan, Singapore, Australia, US, and Canada have joined the Clean Network. My good friend Telefonica CEO Jose Lopez remarked, Telefonica is proud to be a 5G Clean Path company. Telefonica in Spain and UK are fully clean networks, and Telefonica Deutschland and Brazil will be equipped with only trusted vendors. But NATO is only as strong as our weakest link. Countries may be tempted to auction off 5G contracts to lowest bidders, but this approach exposes us all to undue risks. NATO allies and partners must acknowledge the intersection between 5G providers and national security equities, including interoperability, information sharing, and resilience against coercive tactics. By building safe networks today, governments can ensure the integrity of their systems and prevent costly countermeasures way far down the road. Since NATO's foundation, 1949, collective security has been the hallmark of this alliance. Many of our NATO countries have come a long way, transitioning at great human and economic cost from an authoritarian regime into a democratic state that we all enjoy today. They know firsthand how authoritarian regimes use data to exert leverage. We will stand firm to protect against this. Modern technologies should expand people's opportunities, not expand a government's control over them. President Reagan's tear down the wall speech, combined with Europe's solidarity movement, was such a crucial catalyst in bringing down the Iron Curtain. And I really believe this is emblematic of the unity and solidarity which will be required to never allow ourselves to be intimidated or undermined by China's Great Firewall. The Clean Network and the EU 5G toolbox provide strength in numbers for the transatlantic nations, governments, as well as our companies. History has taught us there is power and strength in unity and solidarity. And together, we can control our 5G destiny and ensure we lead our people down the clean path of a safe and secure future. So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up to the audience. If you could submit your questions, there's a box at the bottom, Q&A, and I'll sort through those questions. And if you would please identify yourself, including your affiliation, if you're a journalist, what outlet you're with. Undersecretary Krach, I wanted to follow up. You spoke a lot about 5G, and I know that bans on Chinese telecommunication systems may be costly to industries, downstream industries that use 5G that are trying to compete, let's say autonomous vehicles. These Chinese companies are so heavily subsidized, as you've mentioned, using another carrier will be more expensive. Would the United States and key allies and partners consider subsidizing 5G and other related technologies as part of this strategy of competing with China's state subsidies?
Well, I think, Karen, one of the things you see is, by the way, I'm getting a lot of feedback on the, sorry about that, Karen. I sound really loud.
You sound good.
How's that? Can you hear me, Karen?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry about that. So one of the things that United States has done is we've expanded our capabilities in terms of our International Development Finance Corporation. So when you look at what the International Development Finance Corporation is funding, it's not just highways, bridges, and roads, but also technology infrastructure. So in some particular cases, the United States will do that, as well as our other Blue Dot Network partners like Japan and Australia. We know of a lot of governments that are doing that as well. And, you know, it's interesting because I talk to a lot of telco CEOs, a lot of governments, and they'll say, look, it's less expensive. We sign no backdoor agreements, all those kind of things. And the expense is really in the long term. And we know that China's subsidizing these 5G networks because they know how valuable that data is. In some cases, they're giving it away for free. We've really seen nations really step up now and really understand the tremendous risk in a 5G network.
Great. The questions are pouring in, so I'll just ask one more. I wanted to ask you about the 2020 Prague 5G Security Conference. Last year, this conference led to the Prague proposals, which formed the basis of a coalition to develop better security standard for 5G. Can you tell us what happened this year and how that'll be taken forward?
Yeah, I had a chance to participate, as did Secretary Pompeo. It's really taken it to the next level. And you know, if you look at the international accepted standards in the Clean Network, it really much of it derives from the Prague proposals themselves. And I think here again, when you look at the nations involved in that, and you've really got a great sign of support. And, when I have my interactions with my counterparts in other countries, always sitting right there on the table is that 800-pound elephant called China's retaliation. And the Prague principles of this group of nations, it really provides great unity and solidarity and strength in numbers when dealing with that bully. And so I think that the Czech Republic can be really proud. The founding nations can be really proud, and we see that expanding as we take it to the next level.
Great. I'm going to ask you a question that came in from Gabrielle Carrere. She's a reporter at Italian media Formice.net, and she has two related questions. She wants to ask you about today, Secretary Pompeo is in Italy to meet with Prime Minister Conte and the foreign minister to discuss the U.S.-Italy bilateral relationship. The question is, why would it be important for Italy to join the Clean Network? And a related question is about the consequences. Can the use of untrusted IT vendors really put U.S. intelligence sharing policy with NATO allies at risk?
Well, I think there's no doubt about that they can certainly put it at risk. And, I've experienced, whether it was when I was at General Motors or in Silicon Valley, having intellectual property stolen. It wasn't until I got to the government that I understood that China has a National Intelligence Act that requires any Chinese company, state-owned or otherwise, or any Chinese citizen, to turn over any information, proprietary technology, intellectual property, or data upon request. The Chinese Communist Party or the PRC or the PLA, or suffer the consequences. And since I've been in government, I think it's been beyond my wildest imagination. I think what they're capable of doing. So I think the biggest issue for Italy is their own national security. I think that's key. And as I mentioned too, Italy is such an important part of NATO and the European Union. And, if you look at this network of countries and also the companies that correspond with it, it's all part of a system, and you're only as strong as your weakest link. So, and clearly we respect Italy's right to make their own 5G decisions. We see some really great action there with Telco Italia. Decided to just go with trusted vendors, and we're really hoping that that all the rest of them follow suit. But we respect every country's right to make that decision. We just want to be able to share with them our experiences, share with them our best practice, as well as NATO's and the European Union. I think Thierry Breton at the European Union has done a great job in defining that 5G EU toolbox. And an interesting thing is, in that toolbox, it designates that the board of directors of the telco operators have to make the 5G supplier decision. And if they choose a high-risk supplier, which is defined in that toolbox, and something goes wrong, the board members themselves may be liable.
Here we have a question from Alan Crawford from Bloomberg News. He's actually asking about Taiwan and semiconductors, which is a particular interest of mine. I belong to the small semiconductor nerd set. And he wants to know a little bit about the sentiment in Taiwan, any concerns over losing business, the arguments he used to convince them that cutting off sales to Huawei and others is worth it. And I'm just curious generally what you think about the security of the supply chain all the way back to semiconductors and US and European provision.
Yeah. Well, the Taiwanese people are a model of democracy and capitalism. And they are just, they've really done an amazing job. And in the semiconductor business, they're the leaders in semiconductor fabrication. And that's why we were really honored that TSMC onshored, biggest onshoring in U.S. history, $12 billion, their most advanced fab. And they made that announcement. As maybe you know, I 2 weeks ago, I was in Taiwan I was the highest ranking State Department official since 1979. The purpose of the visit was to go to the funeral of President Lee, who is really the father of their democracy. But I did have a chance to have dinner with President Tsai, and it was great, as well as with Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC. And they are a like-minded economy, just like all the nations are in Europe. So they're really, I think they've been a great partner. They have incredible high technology capabilities, and they're really a model democracy in that region.
We have another question from Ian Brzezinski, actually. And he says that the U.S. has signed a number of 5G MOUs with key NATO allies. What sorts of bilateral and multilateral 5G initiatives are being launched under these MOUs? And Ian is a former ambassador and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council.
Of course.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. And if you look at what these agreements do, it was really the beginning of the Clean Network. And we've expanded that to also include not just countries that sign these agreements, but also ones like a Luxembourg, where all three of their telcos are going with trusted vendors. Or in some cases, some countries put in laws and regulations that will prevent untrusted vendors by default. But also, Secretary Pompeo announced a few months ago, or actually it was in August, the beginning of August, the expansion of the Clean Network with the launch of Clean Cloud, Clean Carrier, Clean Cable, Clean Store. And these initiatives are really key because if you look at 5G, it is that backbone of that surveillance state. And these are the extensions of that are part of this system. And there's a lot of other ones in terms of what goes along with that. I mean, it could be clean drones, clean Internet of Things. And it's really important that gets addressed as well. So I think you're seeing these initiatives from us in terms of expanding that network. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here in Europe. I'm here to, spend a lot of time with not just the governments, but with the private sector CEOs. I've already had some great meetings. I had a number of meetings with some of the biggest CEOs in Germany, for example. And it's really been comforting to know that they understand the risk, not just in the 5G side, but all these different accessories kind of off that. It's one big network.
Great. We have two questions about Open RAN technology. One from Martin Bergstrom and one from Joshua New at IBM. And the question is really, I mean, as you know, Open RAN has been suggested as a competitive alternative to Huawei. And one of the questions is, should the Europeans be preparing for Open RAN technology and implementation faster than they currently think? Is this, what's the prognosis for that?
Well, I don't know how fast they think, but I think, from my pattern recognition in Silicon Valley, it usually happens not as soon as you hope, but sooner than you do think. And I think that this is a natural extension in terms of a little mini paradigm shift happening out there. And we already see a lot of technology companies in Silicon Valley and around the world really developing some great technologies. And it's a natural thing that's happening in terms of opening that into Open RAN. It makes it more of a competitive market. It allows innovation to be accelerated, and it allows companies to innovate at scale. So no doubt things are heading in that direction, but it's not it's not imminent like this year. So it'll take a while to develop.
Will the government, will the U.S. government be, will the U.S. government be promoting Open RAN? Will it be working with, is it going to get behind that approach?
Well, I think we're already doing a lot of things in that area. We spend a lot of time with a lot of our technology companies. I mean, we're always going to promote that next phase of technologies, but also at the same time, big strength of the United States is entrepreneurship. So these things are best developed in that free market where you have fast innovation cycles and companies who really know how to innovate at scale, but at the same time allows room for those lean, hungry startups that want to put that trophy on the mantle, and they really, really focus in a particular area. So I think that's good, healthy competition. That's what really drives all the innovation I've ever been experienced with.
We have a lot of questions here. One is from Elizabeth Economy, and she's a senior fellow at both the Hoover Institution and the Council on Foreign Relations. And she asks, could the Undersecretary, that's you, say a few words about how the US and other advanced economies might work to compete more directly with its clean network and 5G and other elements of technology infrastructure in still developing countries? So how to compete with China's digital Silk Road? How can we make inroads when Huawei and other Chinese companies are so embedded?
Yeah, and I think so much of this comes down to what we're doing from not just from a diplomatic standpoint, but from a commercial standpoint. So I think big investment from the private sector. If there's anything I've learned from running economic diplomacy, the United States, is developing nations. They want U.S. private sector investment, or they want European investment, and they particularly want the innovative part of the private sector. So anything we can do to help facilitate that is key. And one of the things we do at the U.S. State Department is we have a program we call our Prosperity Partnership. So it's not only all the tools in our diplomatic toolkit, including our newly rejuvenated Export-Import Bank, USAID, the Development Finance Corp, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is all brings all that financing, but also from the private sector. And when I say private sector, I don't just mean the business sector, also the educational sector, and also the nonprofit sector, which is really powerful in itself. So building these innovation hubs and really helping out these nations, I think this is really key. And we're doing it in a number of nations these days, and it's really successful. And that goes along with that Blue Dot network that builds clean infrastructure with clean financing that has that has those trust standards of good governance, transparency, rule of law, respect for property of all kinds, respect for sovereignty of nations. So it's not like China on what some of the Asian nations call the One Belt, One Way toll road to Beijing, where they're going to bring in their own laborers, their workers, their migrant workers. They want to put them to work, or maybe some of that forced labor from Xinjiang. But it really creates great job opportunities and training for these nations. So it's not a question of just giving them the fish. It's really teaching them how to fish. And I think that's what these nations value most at the end of the day. And, I think if there's anything I've learned is that there is no sustainable prosperity, without liberty. And I think some of these nations are waking up to the truth of communist parties, debt trap diplomacy, and some of the other things that are going on out there.
Just to stick with this issue of sort of unraveling the connections and the supply chain, And getting back to semiconductors for one second, Alan Crawford, Bloomberg, asked a follow-up question, which is about pushback from the US chip industry over the tightening of restrictions on Huawei. And what do you tell them? What do you tell the chip industry, given the US restrictions and what it means for them?
You mean for the U.S. tech industry?
US semiconductor industry, especially because of the impact on them of the Huawei restrictions.
Yeah. By the way, they get it totally. We meet with the leaders of those semiconductor companies, and when you look at the export controls, for example, that went on, affected all semiconductor industry participants equally all around the world, and they totally understand that. And they totally understand that China is furiously or feverishly, let me put it that way, at work in China trying to catch up. And the Chinese government's putting in billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to try to do that because they understand how strategic that is. But in Huawei's case, and in some of these other semiconductor companies in China, they're part of that military machine, number one, and they're actually the backbone of that surveillance state that's committing all these human rights abuses. So the companies understand. I mean, they get it. And, it's interesting because I spent so many years, I spent 30 years in Silicon Valley, and in January, I took Secretary Pompeo out to Silicon Valley and hosted him for 4 days. It hardly goes 4 days anywhere. And the first night we had dinner at my home. We had 36 of the top CEOs. And one of the things we said to him is like, look, the Chinese Communist Party is just a real and urgent threat to democracy. It's to your companies because they don't want to compete. They want to put you out of business. And I also said, in Silicon Valley, we say corporate responsibility, social responsibility. Well, it's also national security as well. And we've seen a real change of direction in that area. And we had those companies go around and tell some of their China stories. And we had a safe environment, and it's pretty alarming stuff.
I wanted to ask you about clean cloud for a second. We've spoken a lot about 5G, and maybe you can just explain a little bit about how that's going to change facts on the ground. We have Alibaba buying cloud centers in the US, but then again, we've seen the interest in Chinese hackers in gaining access to intelligence of US firms through cloud providers. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about how this clean network, what its implications are going to be, and loosely related to this, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the EU's European Cloud Initiative.
Yeah. So when Secretary Pompeo announced the clean cloud, he mentioned three companies: Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, their cloud business, and their cloud business is like Huawei's 5G business, that, they have to give that data upon command. And we know also that they are tools of the Chinese Communist Party. The CEO of Tencent himself said 10 years ago that the internet needs to be controlled. Alibaba has participated in the Xinjiang human rights abuses. So, look at that as an extension of that 5G. And clouds are really important, whether it's service cloud or in data centers themselves. Now, it just so happens there's a ton of players in that business who make servers and those kind of things. This is a big deal, I think. And it's a big deal for data centers in the US, and I know it's a big deal for data centers in Europe. And I was talking to one of the European CEOs, and he's acknowledging, at some point, they've got to, they really want to take that equipment out of there.
Do you have any thoughts about the separate from this clean network? Earlier, Europe had announced their own cloud, as a way of their strategy, their data strategy and their competitiveness strategy. Do you have any reactions or thoughts about that? That's from Peter Chase, who's with the German Marshall Fund.
Yeah, I think one of the very key things is to make sure that there's good reciprocal data flow, amongst nations. And by the way, that's an issue with China's great one-way firewall. It's a one-way street. And obviously to make sure to protect data privacy and security. I mean, the opportunities between the Europeans and the US and all the cross-trafficking all around the world is really, really key. And I think that's why we're taking that action against China, because they're extending that one-way firewall. I think as long as it doesn't inhibit the private sector motion or what we're trying to do as an alliance, I think it's fine. You've got to address global issues in terms of localization, stuff like that. So it's got to be commercially viable. It's got to be reciprocal, and it's got to be transparent.
Well, you have been remarkably patient. We have so much interest, and we had so many questions. I want to give you an opportunity if you have any closing remarks. Maybe you want to talk to us about next steps, but I want to thank you on behalf of the German Marshall Fund and our incredibly interested audience. I know you have many places to go. Well,
I just want to thank the German Marshall Fund for everything that you do. What's interesting is I've never worked in government before. I've spent my whole career in the private sector. This is the honor of my life, serving country. I mean, I got to experience the American dream. And this may show you how naive I was, but coming into government, I didn't even realize that the North Star is national security. And that's true for the governments in Europe and elsewhere. And what I've really come to realize is that that North Star of national security is about protecting democracies. And in the United States, democracy is just a little over 200-year experiment. And it goes against all the laws of physics. It's not the natural order of things. The natural order of things is the bad king, the dictator, the emperor, and we literally have to fight every day to preserve our democracies. And without countries like the United States or European allies or Canada, there wouldn't be so many of these democracies in this world. And I tell my family, it's like, that white picket fence back in Ohio, that home we grew up in, with 2.5 children and a dog, that doesn't come naturally. You got to fight every day. And Europeans have a great perspective on it. Sometimes in the U.S. we take it for granted. So I really appreciate, I'm sure everybody in this audience and for sure what you do with the German Marshall Fund. And thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to share some of the things that we're experiencing in the United States State Department. Thank you.